Golden State Media Concepts bring you Book Review Podcast, a haven for bookworms of all ages and the widest genres, from mystery to memoirs, romance to comedy, fantasy to sci-fi. If you love to read, this is a podcast for you. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast.
Welcome to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Sarah, and I hope you are having a wonderful Tuesday so far. I hope your weekend was great. I, as usual, can't really remember what we did on our weekend. Probably worked, housework, maybe some yard work. I don't know. It's fine. Whatever. I have no memory. It's fine. I did do interviews, which is why we're here, right? Author interviews. And I gave you misinformation at the end of the last episode. I said that this episode would be Allison Levy and her book Gatekeeper. That is actually the next episode. So I was just a little bit ahead of myself. Today, I am speaking with author Sarah C. Patten about her book, The Measure of Gold. It is World War II. You know that I love me some World War II historical fiction. I am so happy that in the last couple of years, maybe even 3 or 4 years over the course of the podcast, I have been able to read so many different historical fiction, World War II, memoirs, etc. And in addition to what I've been reading for the podcast, there's been some fabulous books out as well that I've had the chance to read. It's just, there's so many different aspects of that time period and so many things that we don't always learn because, you know, it was literally a world war. It took place all over the world. It was over the course of many years. And so to try and cover that even in a full semester of college, it would be not enough. So the fact that people do research and they write these novels, then I get to read them, is pretty fabulous. It's also pretty fabulous that this is my first Sarah on the podcast, whose name is spelled the same as mine. We had Sarah Summers on a while back, no H, and then a couple of months, few weeks, whatever. Soraya Wilson was here, and that she has an extra I and a whole extra syllable because of that I. But now we have Sarah C. Patten, and I don't know why I like finding people who have the same name as I do. It used to drive me crazy in school. In grad school, I was part of a very, very, very small class, and there were 6 Sarahs in that class of like 25 people. So I don't know. It annoyed me then. It kind of excites me now. Whatever. Let's talk about the book. As I said, it is called The Measure of Gold, and here is the description. An epic story of alchemy, betrayal, courage, and transcendent love. No magic is more powerful or dangerous than the spell of love. It is 1940, and Germany has just invaded France. Across the ocean in Sweetwater, Tennessee, Penelope, an alluring young alchemist, receives a letter from her childhood friend Naomi, urging her to France. Bereft from the loss of her widowed father, Penelope leaves her life and travels to German-occupied Paris. There she meets Naomi's brother, the brilliant alchemist Fulcanelli, and his mysterious apprentice, Lucien. Falling headlong into alchemy's esoteric world, she helps Fulcanelli and Lucien resist the Nazi forces. She trains as a spy and infiltrates a powerful brothel, Le Chambrement. As the horrors of war close in around her, Penelope must seduce a murderous Nazi officer in a desperate calculation to save her lover, Lucien. Through the devastating magic of life, Penelope learns that alchemy has far more to do with the person than the element. So again, that is the description of The Measure of Gold, and I love that it has this added element of alchemy, and we'll talk more about alchemy and why Sarah chose to include that in this story in the interview. But you get the historical fiction, a young woman who ends up being part of the resistance in Europe during World War II, that's something that maybe those of us who like these types of novels have read before. But then you throw in this element of alchemy, and it just adds that little bit of nuance, that little bit of difference to give it a slightly different angle into the story. And I really appreciated that about this. Just, whatever you think about alchemy, and I think a lot of us don't necessarily always understand alchemy. The word magic is used in the description, and sometimes we think, oh, alchemy, magic, that whatever, that's just not real. Well, it's, anything that is before proven to be science is often considered magic, and alchemy is just kind of the precursor of a lot of the science that we know now. So at any rate, I'm not going to lecture you about alchemy. It's not my forte. We are going to go ahead, and instead of me lecturing you, we're going to talk about this book. So let's turn to the interview with Sarah C. Patten. Again, the book is called The Measure of Gold.
Hi, Sarah. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me, Sarah. I really appreciate it.
I am excited to have you to talk about your book, The Measure of Gold. I'm also excited because you're not my first Sarah author, but you're the first one that's been spelled correctly. So I'm very happy to have the H on your name. I'm a dork, but it's okay.
No, it's a thing. It's a thing for Sarahs. I know. We always are like, H, no H. It means a lot to us. Yeah, I agree.
And then a couple weeks ago, I interviewed a woman whose name is Soraya, spelled the same but with an extra I. So,
that's great.
Do you get the H in weird places though when you say it's Sarah with an H?
Yes, I do. Yeah.
Okay. just thought I'd ask and see if anybody else had that, or if it was just me.
That's always a head scratcher when that happens. No,
right.
I mean Sarah with an H, like Sarah, and then add an H at the end. Yeah. Seems basic, but I don't know. I've worked I had a receptionist job once, though, when I was in college, and you get this, when people are telling you numbers and letters, it's this mind jumble that happens, too, when you're on the receiving end of information. So I sort of get how there's this, like, stage fright element that happens for people where they jumble it.
No, I totally get it. I once asked somebody to spell their last name, and they very sarcastically said SMITH, and I was like, oh, just how it sounds, Smith.
Like, that's what I thought. I'm checking you.
Anyway, let's talk about your book and not our name. Again, it's called The Measure of Gold. Before we get to the actual story, if you could share a little bit about yourself, that would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. So I grew up in a little town outside Chattanooga, Tennessee, in North Georgia, and I grew up there. I lived right next to my grandparents, across the gully from my aunt and uncle, down the street from my other aunt and uncle. We had a little family compound that I grew up in with a brother and a sister, my parents, and then started writing when I was pretty young, actually, and then carried that into college. My dad said when I was a senior in high school that I could go anywhere I wanted for college, but it had to be outside of the South. So I left the Chattanooga area and decided to go up to Ithaca and to Cornell, and continued writing, found some great mentors there, and then went on to writing program at Dartmouth, and then decided it was time to come back to the South, and settled in Asheville with my husband and 3 kids and 4 dogs, and we've been here for about 20 years while I've been teaching and writing, and then now just writing. So that's the overview.
Okay, 3 kids and 4 dogs. That's a lot of parenting.
Yes, it is. Yeah, it's there was at one point a friend of mine was giving me an interview, and she said, what should I ask you? And I said, well, if you want to like comic relief, you can ask how many dogs did you have? Like, what was the most amount of dogs you had while writing this manuscript? And the answer was 8.
Oh my gosh.
And I was like, because I do have a thing for stray dogs that I I can't like pass a stray dog without like coming to assistance. And so anyway, there was a moment in time where we had bumped it up all the way to 8. And I think my family was almost killed me at that point, but we ended up rehoming those dogs, and it's all been good.
Good. Do you have a large yard?
My parents have a farm that they live on, so we spend a lot of time there, but not as large as you would think. But I do like to run in the woods a lot with my dogs, and so I take them all, I rotate them on runs and stuff, so they're good. But no, not as large a yard as you might think for that many dogs. But we do get out of town a bit, and they have a wide open farm they can run around in and be very happy.
Very nice. You're not on TikTok, are you? Because I saw a woman walking in the woods with her dogs and picking up another one. That wasn't you, was it?
I feel like I might be in the wrong career. I should just have a TikTok channel about my dog situation, and I would probably do better. But no, I'm not on TikTok.
I love it. All right. So the book is historical fiction, World War II. It's called The Measure of Gold. Can you give an overview of the story?
Yes. Yeah. So me and the dogs. No, I love reading about history. It's actually one of the things I do. And now that we live in a podcast world, I also listen to a lot of lectures and stuff like that in my free time. And so when I don't have a book, I often go back to Eleanor Roosevelt and FDR biographies, of which there are many. And so, it's like 7 or 8 years ago, and I was reading about FDR, and I came across a quote from Churchill about his favorite spy in World War II, and as a woman, which was really surprising to me, named Christina Skarbek. And I was like, what's that about? And so I ended up reading her biography, which then led me to a biography called The Wolves at the Door about Virginia Hall. Since that time, a book has come out about her in the last couple of years, but that was the previous book about her. And then I just started reading. I was like, I want to know, who are all these women who are doing this? And so I really went pretty deep with that. And so I created a story that pays homage to the women of World War II. So I created a woman from rural Tennessee who, through a series of unexpected circumstances and a desperate letter from a friend, gets called to Paris, to help her friend who's in trouble. And she goes without question, sort of naively, and ends up in the center of Paris just after the German occupation. And she ends up getting drawn into the French resistance, and then ends up training in Churchill's SOE organization, and then coming back into Paris to help her friends, being placed in a brothel as a spy, as a maid who spies on the Germans who have overtaken the brothel. And so she has to get her way out of that problem and somehow save her friends in the meantime. And so it's a story of espionage, alchemy, adventure, and set in World War II that I think is pretty exciting. Has a couple unexpected plot twists and is very entertaining from what I've heard.
Mm-hmm. One thing that I really appreciate about it is that I love World War II novels. I've read, especially in the last couple of years with the podcast, but just in general. And this one combines several elements because you've got Paris during the occupation, but you've also got England in the SOE and that program. But then you've also got alchemy, which is not something that I've had in a World War II novel before. So talk a little bit about alchemy, your choice to include that element, what it is for people who may not know, etc.
Came upon it, yeah, that's a great question. I came upon alchemy in a sort of unexpected way. Because my writing process, and I've heard other authors talk about this, is I really just follow the crumbs, and it leads me really unexpected places. Why I love libraries is because you can just, follow this sort of genuine train of thought and my research is like that. I research and I'll find a little crumb of something, just sort of like I narrated with the reading about FDR and Churchill and finding Christina Skarbek, you sort of always, you never know what you're going to find. And I try to get to it with an open curiosity. And so I knew, because it was set in Paris, that I wanted Notre Dame to be figure in symbolically, thematically, really heavily. And so I wanted to learn everything I could about Notre Dame. And I found this book called The Mysteries of the Cathedral, written by this esoteric alchemist named Fulcanelli. I didn't know that about him at the time. I just found the book. And it was this bizarre book about the Gothic architecture and all the mathematical, symbolic elements that were built into that. And I was like, I need to know more about this, which then led me to that he had been inspired by Isaac Newton, who had believed that all the laws of the universe were written in Gothic architecture in plain sight for all the Europeans. This is the more sort of esoteric, mystical Newton that was really more of who he was than the, the laws of science Newton. He was very much a mystic. So I read biographies about him. And what the sum total feeling I had with all that research was that there's, and I think it's true about life, that there's this, you're born, you live your life, and, hardship is part of life. There's no way you could avoid, for example, the pandemic. This is what's happening to everybody, and in our own versions of it around the world. And so hardship is part of life, and it's sort of what do you do and who do you become as a result of whatever those sort of intimate stories or more global stories, as it were, how those influence your person and what happens to you and who you become. And alchemy is very much thematically also that, is it's both a spiritual and a scientific journey. And it worked really well. You have the base metals, and the theory is you add an agent of change or heat. Fire is the most obvious one, but there's other ones you can add, and you pass it through the fire, and either it becomes nothing, just a crumbled up bunch of nothing, or the goal of it is to make it gold. And I really liked that thematically, as far as what I believe that happened during World War II, where you had this really distinct battle between good and evil, and people, and it was just sort of pressed down upon society. And people, everybody wants to think that they're going to be the hero who does the right thing in a moment. But the way the Nazis exerted power over people, that wasn't an easy choice. And a lot of people who made that choice lost their lives in brutal ways, or their families were destroyed or killed or taken from them. And so I really thought the alchemy metaphor matched really well with what was actually happening sort of spiritually and existentially for people at the time. So I added that. I think it also added for me an element of imagination that could soften the edges of some of the harshness of the brutality of World War II. It was hard. It was a hard era to live in. There comes a point when you're writing a book where you sort of live more in that world than you do in your own world to some extent. And because you have to hold it all together, and it has to have symmetry and it has to be whole for it to be believable. And I think the alchemy gave me a little bit of leeway with the brutality of World War II, because I'm such a sensitive person that it was just hard to think about the realities of that war and live in that fully without any sort of like respite or something softer or more imaginative to believe in. I needed something to believe in, and I needed my characters to have something to believe in. And so it was a thread that softened and added a metaphorical element that I could sort of weave throughout the story and hopefully enhance some of the pieces of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that. I really appreciate the depth that you went into talk about alchemy. I think sometimes people just think of it as sort of magic. I mean, it was the precursor to chemistry, though. And so while we may see it as quote unquote magic because we have come a lot further in terms of understanding chemical reactions, it was a way of thinking and a way of trying to understand elements and chemical reactions at the time. So,
and it was I feel like it's such a cool sort of nexus of imagination and science.
Mm-hmm.
because, and it allowed us to make these giant leaps forward, because of it was like, what happens, Isaac Newton had his Royal Society. One of the reasons I named the resistance group the Royal Society is sort of paying homage to his Royal Society in Britain, where they would literally just sit in an auditorium and be like, well, what happens if we transfuse pig's blood into a man? And they would all sit around. It's like so gory, and be like, what happened? And like, okay, that one didn't go well, like, less, like, it was just like really intense. It was sort of this wide open. I feel like it's what was some of those shows in the early 2000s, like the X Factor or whatever, where they were just like, had to develop ethics around reality TV. It was sort of like that, where it was like, it was so gory, but also, yeah, exactly. Like that's where Newton came up with light theory. He presented it similarly in that round table of, of the ideas that was happening, and you could get booed out, and like all this. It's sort of like the WWF of scientists.
I love it.
But I imagine it was like incredibly entertaining if you had the stomach for it. But anyway, it was just, and I do, obviously I'm glad that science has evolved beyond that to some extent. But I also think that one of the things that Einstein and Newton had was this like incredible imaginative piece that allowed them to think outside of what we could perceive, and that's really what alchemy is about. And of course, it was horribly discounted at the time, but I think we could use a greater dose of that moving forward with humanity. And I think it's one of the reasons we were able to take such a big step forward with Newton, is because he was so imaginative.
We're going to take our first break of the podcast, but before we do that, can I just say that sounds like the most fabulous, nerdiest, craziest reality TV show possible. I would watch that. People presenting their theory, their ideas, their crazy ideas, and then having them shouted down or supported, and then maybe we have a huge advancement in science. Does that make me weird? It's okay. I'm okay with that. Let's go ahead and take our first break of the podcast. While the break is happening, you can contemplate what crazy, possibly brilliant idea you would bring to that reality TV show, or, just that forum if it weren't a reality TV show. Stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Golden State Media Concepts bring you the Bible Study Podcast. Reflect and journey the Bible as together we study God's Word and be inspired. Bible study made fun and informative for all ages. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Bible Study Podcast.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. Before the break, Sarah was talking about the forum for bringing those scientific or maybe not so scientific ideas to that group and have them being debated in often very shouty kind of ways. So let's go ahead and turn back to the interview with Sarah C. Patten. Again, we're talking about her book, The Measure of Gold.
Well, and I feel like pretty much any major advance in technology and science that we have today is because somebody had some idea that at the time seemed absolutely preposterous. And
totally,
some of those ideas actually worked, and now we have what we have. And some of those ideas were like pig's blood and turning it into a person, not so much. But somebody had to come up with these ideas.
Yeah, no, for sure. And that was, that was one of those moments where, the atomic bomb was not imaginable, and I wanted, it was a race of science. World War II was, we think about all the horrible elements that happened, and, behind the scenes, there was this arms race happening where these giant leaps of imagination in science. And I did want to pay homage to that because, it was, the Germans, everybody knew about the atomic bomb and they were racing to see who could be the first to create it. And then once that got created, what happens? And of course, the tragedy of what happened in Japan, it did silence the brutality of the war, and it really had science had the final say in World War II. And, everybody's been sort of sitting on pins and needles ever since then of like, okay, now we've created this monster. What do we do? But, it was that big scientific leap that sort of ended everything in this abrupt and horrific way. So anyway, it's all there. It was hard for me to stop writing about the book. I had to at some point I had to just be like, stop writing the book and put it out there. And I actually ended up breaking it into pieces. And this is the World War II piece, because it was just like, history never stops. It's always marching and it's always interesting and it's always unexpected. And so, that was, I think there will be at some point, not now, I need a break from the story. I needed a break from the story to work on other projects. But, at some point I'll answer the questions about what happened after the book. And then of course there's a whole story about what happened before the book that I wrote. I wrote it all, or at least in notes. So those are coming one day.
All right. Let's talk a little bit more about Penelope as the main character. What about her do you think will resonate with readers?
I think she's a really compelling character. For me, one of the things that I find, with this sort of Marvel comic surge, which is so fun, my kids love the movies and all the comic books, and it's so exciting. As a historian, that's not really what happens in history. It's not the Rambo. There are very few Rambos. And if they are, they're like, those are people that are problematic. It's like more historically, you more have the Penelopes who are just these sort of profoundly stoic and internally complicated people making difficult choices. It's actually really more what happens in my assessment of history, and those are a lot of times the change agents. Sometimes I think the more big personalities take credit for that work, but and I think that for me, Penelope, I named her after Odysseus's wife, who was the sort of queen of this sort of resistance. She was resisted the suitors and maintained Ithaca as her island and her husband's domain. And she wasn't out there fighting like Wonder Woman. She was just quietly resisting and using a very different type of power, which I think is often undervalued. And one of the things that struck me when I was reading about all these heroines from World War II was that, they were underestimated. They didn't have a lot of agency in French society or in any society at that time. And, they had to find other means of getting there. It wasn't really until a couple years into the war that Winston Churchill realized how unbelievably influential women could be, that they could be these sort of invisible spies in the room, just, quietly cleaning or being a translator or a secretary, but they were imbibing all this information that was, and they were basically discounted. And so they, once that was figured out, if you drop, for example, a man into a small town in France, that's noticeable. At that time, if they were to drop women into these remote areas in France, it really wasn't that noticeable, especially if she dressed like a peasant or peddled something on the street. She could be largely invisible. And so what I think, or I hope people like about her is that she has that more subtle strength that I think is often undervalued in our society, that women often possess. You look at Rosa Parks. Well, Rosa Parks, was this incredible hero in our society, and she resisted. She just sat, and stayed put and didn't give in. And I think women are really good at that. And that's in so many ways, that's what the women of the French Resistance also did, is they they sort of dug their heels in and made it very difficult for the Nazis to navigate French society. And Penelope is that. And then she, like all heroines, like a Rosa Parks type figure, knew the moment to strike. And so there's a long build up of her life of positioning her for that moment, creating the problem that Penelope has, and then giving her a moment where you're like, come on, girl, do it. And she does what needs to be done. And it's the sort of change agent in the story. And that's where she discovers who she really is. Is she up for it? Oh, yes, she is. She can do it. So then what happens once she's, the book is climaxed? So I think that people will get behind her journey. It's definitely not like a Wonder Woman type story. It's a more subtle and I think more realistic story about what really happened and how women helped sort of flip and kick out the Nazis, kick them out of Europe and send them back to Germany, for once and for all, for that reckoning to happen. So I think that, and I think she's compelling. She falls in love, and I think it's a really sweet love story that evolves. I think people really enjoy that part. And then she does meet these moments of suspense with, I think, an unexpected kind of strength that I have a lot of admiration for. Hopefully other people will too.
Mm-hmm. And you really get a fairly clear picture of Penelope early in the book, because the book starts with the letter from her friend Naomi begging her to come to Paris. And she does. Like, I'm thinking, it's World War II. We haven't entered the war yet. I am safe in my home in Tennessee. No, I'm not going to Nazi-occupied Paris. But that is what Penelope does. She gets on a boat and she so you get a
and that was one of the hardest things.
Yeah.
I think to make that believable, and that was why it was so interesting to me when I found out about like Christina Scarbeck or Josephine Baker, or there were so many people who was like, why did they do that? You could literally just be like sitting at home, with a victory garden, and be far, far away from this horrible war. And so who are the people that would make that decision? And because there were a lot, and so she that Naomi was her only person left, and so she had to make that choice. She had lost everything in the States. And I think there was an element of naivete that led her there, where she really didn't understand what she was getting into fully, which is, there were a couple examples of that where women from rural areas just like really didn't understand, because of lack of access to news and so forth, what the deal was. But they were also very tough because they'd grown up in rural America. So they had a grit and an ability to sort of cope that was empowering for them. And so, I tried to make her that. But yeah, it was an insane decision to do that. But, when you have nothing left to lose, that's when people make those types of decisions where they're like, you know what, I'm going to go help my friend because she's asking me. She's never asked for anything. And I'm going to go get her out of this situation. Of course, it turned into a very different story than she anticipated, but that's also what happens in life.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, as someone sitting here with hindsight, it's very easy for me to say, to start yelling at the book, don't do it. Of course, then there wouldn't have been a book. No.
Exactly.
So, you've talked about research and, a lot of the research that went into the book. Do you put autobiographical elements in your stories, characters or places?
I think it's almost impossible not to as a writer. I think it's more of a hodgepodge. I draw from a lot of different places, and sort of piece them, weave those into the various characters in various ways. I think, for example, I personally have really long blonde hair. Is Penelope me? No, not at all. But it is an element, one of the things that all the women who were spies had was, there was always a feature once the Germans caught on to the fact that they were, there was some problem with this woman. They would always just have it like a sort of quip to describe her with, like the woman with the limp, the woman with the red hair. So I needed her to have something unique that was identifiable. And I just knew what it was like to inhabit, I have like waist length, long blonde hair. And so I just knew what it was like to inhabit that. And so I felt like I could write authentically about that. And I needed something that I hadn't. It's always so tempting to be like, oh, yeah, a woman with a limp wooden leg. That's great. Virginia Hall. How could you trump that? But you can't use it. You have to come up with your own thing. Right. And so I stuck with that. So that type of thing is in there. And I made her from Tennessee because I think you have to write what you know at some level. And I was taking her so far from what I knew into World War II France that I needed to ground it in that. And then, my mother-in-law was like, oh, I see, there's certain details from various family lore where she's like, that's just like Addie's mom, her mom died, and I was like, yep, that is, so you always weave in things that are like beautiful elements or poetic elements that you've observed in your own life. But it's not, there's nothing linear about her connection with my life and her own story. It's really her own story. There's just little patches and reflections of me. And I think the theming of the story is definitely consistent with a lot of the stuff I think about, I'm such a big, one of my biggest feelings in life is past is prologue. And, it's like a philosophy that I sort of live by, is like, and you look at history and you just see patterns repeat. I remember a year ago, people were like, what's going to happen? What's going to happen? And I'm like, oh, well, there are going to be, 3 spikes in the virus. And, I feel like, why do you think that? And I'm like, because of the Spanish flu. Like, you just look back and, and then we're going to have a period of the roaring 20s. And, it's not, of course, it's not going to be exactly that. It'll be its own version of that. But it's, people like to pretend like, I remember just reading some article from someone from Silicon Valley. It was some big Google executive who's like, history books are worthless. Why would you ever look back? We're only surging forward. And I was like, you're a fool, man. Oh, geez. You have to look back. You have to look back. It was actually terrifying. Yeah. I was like, no, that's so arrogant. Like, and of course, the story of Penelope is a story about when things don't go as predicted. And of course, those are the stories that are like eye-catching. But largely, people's behavior is largely predictable. People, history, pulses forward in this very predictable way to a large extent. I think there are exceptions to that, but in general, history is such a profound teacher. And so you can see like that part of me so deeply imbued within the text, when she goes back and is about to return to France, or is trying to entice people to believe in her. And she's like, talks about how, look, human behaviors are predictable. Like, think about this and think about how you can predict German behavior, this really tightly woven set of ideas that embodies their code of living. Like, you can predict what they're going to do and how they're going to react. And that's very much me sort of talking through the character in that moment about what I really believe, that if you really sit down and think about, it's true with Donald Trump, is like, no, this man is incredibly predictable, actually. If you sit down and think about what what his values are, how he has behaved in the past, and you project that forward, you can sort of predict, what might or might not happen. And there's always unexpected elements that get added, but like, that part of the narrative, that part of the imagination and science and Newton, those thematic things are very heavy-handedly Sarah. But the characters themselves are just living in my world and of how I see it and how I've understood World War II or whatever it is that I'm writing about.
Mm-hmm.
So, if that makes sense.
You mentioned, yeah. You mentioned the story before and the story after, and fleshing those out into their own books. I would imagine kind of a series, but standalone books within that series. Do you have an idea of how many books you would like within this overarching story?
I think it'll be a trilogy. I think that I think it'll take me a decade to probably complete it, but a lot of people get left at the end of the book without, I don't want to spoil anything, but like with questions, that about like what happened to certain characters that get left, letters unanswered, and I think, I had I went back and forth on the ending a lot about whether to sew it up neatly or whether to leave it open-ended. And, for me, the nature of World War II, as I understand it, was that it wasn't a time of the internet or Facebook or, where people remained in contact. Like it was really possible to lose people forever in that time in a way that we can't fully imagine. And so I wanted to be consistent with, you come out of World War II and it was utter chaos, particularly in Europe. They had to really spend decades rebuilding society in every way. They had just been gutted. And so I think that I wanted it to be true to what I think would have happened, which was that people lost each other and then maybe found each other, in much later in life and were able to reunite. And so I think that there is another story there of that I knew what had happened to those characters that get sort of lost, and I had versions where those questions were answered, but I think I can, weave a beautiful story of discovery into that sequel to the Measure of Gold. And then, because it was a longer manuscript, I basically already have the first book mostly written. And so I think it would be easy to sort of tailor that and sort of slide it in ahead of, if people want it, it's really, it's in my heart, it's on my computer. If people have interest, I'll pursue that. I also have 3 other books that I'm working on, that I've been working on for about a decade. So there's no hurry for those to come to fruition. So it's sort of a wait and see how the book is received, as the year. It's such an unusual year to come out with a book. That I feel like it's sort of this slow burn, and it's like, if it really takes off in people's hearts and minds and they want more, I'm happy to complete those projects, or, just keep on doing what I'm doing and leave that mystery out there about what happens and let people's imaginations work it out too. Because, there's beauty in both sides of that. Sometimes to be left with questions is also a beautiful experience.
It's time for our second break, but I'm kind of laughing at myself because I don't disagree with Sarah that having questions can be a beautiful experience. Questions are good. Questions not being answered can be a good thing. But for those of you who have been listening to me on this podcast for a while, know that I really like books and life to have epilogues. I like my questions answered, so I'm not always the best at having those unanswered questions, but I'm going to contemplate what that means about me while we take this break, and when we come back, more with Sarah C. Patten. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. I am speaking with Sarah C. Patten about her historical fiction, World War II historical fiction novel, The Measure of Gold. Let's go ahead and return to that interview.
I'm always fascinated with this, well, in any era prior to the internet, really, when we were writing letters and those sorts of things, because that letter at the beginning of the book, that is the impetus for Penelope's journey. First of all, Naomi, letter writing is such a hopeful process. In that period, even if there wasn't a war, you never quite knew if your letter was going to find its way to where it should have been. In the war, that's just amped up exponentially. So the letter that Naomi writes is a letter of hope, of faith. She puts it out there. And then even if Penelope had answered and said, yes, I am coming, that letter could have gone astray. It's just this fascinating process of, you try to communicate with people, but it doesn't always work, or it can take months and months to communicate. We don't think about that much now, that communication is instantaneous. You can send a text, you can send an email, you can send a Snapchat for that matter.
Yeah. So, it's insane. Yeah.
Yeah. I find that pretty fascinating. So.
Well, and for me, I grew up. My grandfather. Oh, sorry. Go on.
Nope. Go ahead.
My grandfather was in World War II, and he helped open the Silk Road. He was a physician, and so he traveled through northern India into China. And he wrote letters to my grandmother, and my cousin Darji and I used to go up. They would be in the attic, and you can imagine, in North Georgia, they would always come in the summer. It was unimaginably hot in that attic. It was like a sauna, like a cedar sauna. But we would go up there and we would read the letters. They were these love letters that he wrote to her. And so I had a fascination with these love letters, and he would never know, he would be like in India, how would those ever necessarily make it back? But, he sent them. And anyway, there were these beautiful letters that I had this fixation with. So I too have this thing about, the letters, that letter writing period. And it's tragic to me that that's been lost in this generation. I the nuances of, I have my great grandmother's journals, all the nuances of handwriting and what that says about a person and what language they choose, with the written hand versus, it's so shortcutty now, that you don't even write the word you, and it's, there's a poetry to it that I am really sad that is lost, because those letters made such an impression on me. And so, I spent a long time on that letter because, to be able to get into the mindset of a letter from that time period that had to be sent through so many discrete channels, because she didn't want to be discovered and have the letter intercepted. And, so it was a really tricky letter to write, and to inhabit the skin of her in that moment. It took me a really, really long time I changed it 1,000 times in subtle ways but yeah, I love letter writing. I wish that there was a whole genre of books that was just in libraries and bookstores that was just letters, like published letters. In fact, I'm writing a book that's set in the Civil War. It'll take me years to finish it, but that is just letters back and forth. And I'm paying homage to that art form that's not really going anywhere at this moment, but may come back. Maybe people decide that there's something to it. But there's nothing more beautiful and romantic than a letter, a handwritten letter. There's just nothing comparable. There's really nothing comparable to it in my mind.
Well, and even when I was in college, email was just kind of starting to really take hold and take over. But I still wrote letters to friends in college, and getting the mail just is not as much fun anymore as it used to be. There are very rarely letters in the mail.
No, I know. We had a neighbor. Not a neighbor. When when I was in graduate school. My husband was in medical school up at Dartmouth. We came to know a guy who was his wife was lovely woman from Peru, and she and I became friends. And never met her husband. And he was he wrote junk mail for a living. He made a lot of money, and I was like, "You're the guy."
I never thought about
we
that.
had a lot of jokes about. Yeah, that was his. Like, he was a freelance junk mail writer, and I was like, oh my gosh, what have you done to my love of letter writing? But he was a nice man and just making a living. But anyway, it was funny. I was like, oh, you're the source of that, huh?
Interesting.
Okay.
Yeah, I never really thought about where those came from.
I didn't either until I met him, and I was like, oh yeah, of course, there's somebody doing that makes that look like that or says that. It was funny.
Huh. You learn something new every day.
Right. I always thought I had this. It was a time where Seinfeld was like really big, and I was like, that's what George Costanza should have done. Like, he should have been cast as a junk mail writer.
Perfect.
Like,
yeah.
I was like, because he sort of I was like, who does this guy remind me of? And I was like, why is he reminding me of George Costanza? And I was like, oh, what a missed. If only you could go back in time, I could write them a letter and say, you need to make him a junk mail writer. That is the ultimate George Costanza.
Yep. Oh, I love it. You mentioned the book with the letters during the Civil War. Any other books that you're working on now that you want to mention?
Yeah, I'm sort of wrapping up. They always call it, before you give it to the editor, which is devastating, they always call it the first draft, when it is so crushing, because you're like, no, this is not the first draft. But the first, quote, first draft of a book. The working title is called The Great Medicine Show, but I actually think I'm going to shift that. That's set at the turn of the century, around the Nashville World's Fair in 1897, and about a woman who grows up in a very, very isolated holler in eastern Tennessee and gets drawn in to a medicine show, traveling the country, peddling the wares of all the tonics and bitters and stuff of that time. And it's an interesting story about that time. And she goes on quite an adventure of her own, and being sort of drawn out of the woods and into this whole other world. And she sells a tonic called the Water of Life around the country, and has like a crazy amount of adventures. And then it's a fun story. I really like it, and it's turned out even better than I thought it would. I had no idea at the time why I was being drawn to it. I had to tamp down the pandemic aspect of it because I don't think people are up for it right now,
right.
Given everything that's happening, and make it more about her personal journey. But I mean, originally, it's funny. You see this, like, you go to writers' conferences and stuff, and you see people. There's like, the writers are a thing, and you're like, and of course, writing is just channeling all these sensitivities and empathies and sort of like intuitions, but not like useful intuitions, just like senses of things. And so, I probably started this like 4 or 5 years ago, and I think now that I'm sort of becoming deeper, more of a writerly writer and more seasoned, I think the key is to get ahead of yourself, like to not procrastinate, to where whatever it is that you're intuiting is about to happen happens. And then you're like, oh no, I'm late to the show, and I have to modify the manuscript. So people are like, I do not want to read about disease in the 1900s. So I had to shift the focus of it, which took a lot of work. But I think it's an even better story because it's more about her becoming this sort of wild hustler and living this sort of adventure in this particular moment in time. So I love the book. I think it's honestly even better than Measure of Gold. I'm super excited about it.
Last break of the podcast. When we come back, we'll be talking more about this idea of past as prologue and how crazy it has been in the last year or so with the pandemic and everything else. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. Together we dive into the world of sci-fi and science fiction. From episodes of Star Trek, Star Wars, to The Walking Dead, Resident Evil, all the hot new science fiction movies from the back doors of Marvel or DC. The Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. You'll never look at science fiction the same way again.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and the conclusion of my interview with author Sarah C. Patten.
I interviewed Lydia Kang about a year ago now, maybe a little more than a year ago, and her book had just happened to take place during the Spanish flu, and
yep.
this is the beginning of lockdown, and I was like, it's too soon. I can't read. It's too soon. 100 years later about the Spanish flu, but no, I can't. Right now, I can't talk. And it's the same thing. People weren't wearing masks, and it was,
it's the same thing. If you read about it, I know you're like, oh, let me guess. People are going to be non-quite going to divide into two, our society, and it's so predictably. When if you think about it, you're like, oh, if only you'd come out with your book a year ahead of time. And I'm sure she's just kicking herself. And then I was laughing. Years ago, I looked back, I was like, all right, I got to have it. I don't really love social media, but I had to have a Instagram account. I was like, okay, it's just these visual representations. I can do that. And I was doing research for my Civil War book. And I was like, this was, 2 or 3 years ago. And I put all these books, Shelby Foote's books up there and Mary Chestnut's diaries and journals and so forth that I was reading, and I said something like, being drawn to Civil War seems like a bad omen. And I was like,
oh no.
And then years later, I'm like, oh. So right now I'm so neck deep in those, all those projects. I don't have a sense of what am I going to write about next? But I'm like, what if I have a different sense of whatever it is that I'm being sort of empathically drawn to, and that there's something a little bit there as far as my past is prologue awareness, that there's that writers a little bit are tuned into what's happening a little bit before it's about to happen. They don't really, it's sort of a vague intuition. It's sort of useless, except that it drives your curiosity around narratives. And so I'm not surprised. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's weird. Things pulse. You see, there were several books that came out, that have come out this year that were just spot on, and you're just like, well done, well timed. Somehow you knew that this was intuitively that this was sort of where their cultural consciousness was going, and that what people would be curious about, and that these were the themes that we were thinking about subconsciously and at our dinner tables. And some people really nail it in an exciting way. About timing, but it's sort of creative process is fascinating that way. But you definitely don't want to write about a pandemic in 2021 or 2022. Have a book that comes out about disease.
Right.
Definitely not on time.
I don't think that readers always. A lot of readers do, but some don't. That they always realize just how lengthy of a process a book is from that first intuitive idea to actually being published. And so you did not, a pandemic book that may have come out in the last year was not written. It's not like they were like, hey, pandemic, I'm going to jump on this bandwagon and write a book, unless you're some kind of a machine. It just does not work that way.
No, it's a 3 to 5 year process minimum. And I think that, that's what's interesting. And you just have to, it's taught me a lot about discipline. You just have to have the discipline to prioritize it and not get sidetracked, which is so easy to do in the creative field. It's not like, my husband's a physician and he can't kick cans down the road. He has to show up for his, 30 patients a day, no matter what. Well, writing, it's it's very, you have to really carve that out. And, and you learn that, you, especially if you're writing historical fiction, I think that, you can see where people who have written books, just stay with it, and their timing is perfect, and their book sales like reflect that perfect timing. And I'm hopeful that I think that movie The Nightingale is coming out with the two sisters.
Oh my gosh, I was thinking about that book, the Kristen Hanna book. I didn't realize it was going to be a movie.
It's gotten delayed because of the pandemic, and so I'm sort of hoping that this book folds in alongside that, thematically, and I think the movie is going to be beautiful because real sisters, or actresses are playing the sisters in it, and it's like the first time that's ever happened, and I think it'll be a really interesting and beautiful depiction of that story, and that would be just random luck if if people reached around and said, oh, what else is written about that, and happened to find my book, that would be random luck. But you do, in writing, you've got to stay with the flow of whatever your creative pulse is, but you also have to have discipline around it, because you don't want other books are definitely being written about what you're writing about. That's just how creativity works. And so you need to stay on target with your timing so that you're not, the 10th book that comes out about the French Resistance, or, or the book about the pandemic right after everybody's just gotten through the hardest 2 years of their life or whatever, And so there's a level of self-discipline that is, really, really important in writing, that and in so many creative fields, that it's essential. It's and it's easy to not prioritize the writing and get, especially when you have 4 dogs and 3 kids, and get sort of sidetracked. But I've gotten a lot better about that as I've gotten older, of being like saying no, having boundaries, carving out time, and that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. So do you think that would be kind of the basis of your advice to aspiring authors, kind of create those spaces, create those boundaries, have some kind of sense of, be a prognosticator as to what will be timely in a couple of years when your books come out?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that's one of my biggest pieces. I think it's really hard as a writer. It takes a long time before you make money doing it. And so, and I think you see someone like Kristen Hanna, if you look at her books, she really became successful after, like 15 or 20 books were written. It doesn't seem like that. Now she seems like a household name. You go to Walmart or Target, there she is, but that was not her journey. She felt really called to it, and she had incredible discipline and tenacity, and was incredibly productive, and followed all the threads, of her imagination and her interests. And now people have discovered her, and they're like going backwards through her work. And I find her story really inspiring, because I think it really, you have to write. If you want to be a writer, you have to really love it, because you're going to get, in the first 10 years of your career, it's going to be mostly rejection. And you have to weather that, and still believe in yourself, and still keep your chin up. And so it has to be something else that drives you, other than like constructive, positive feedback. And you have to have a lot of, fuel in that tank for that journey. And so, having structure and self-discipline, and a amazing group of support and friends who believe in you, and a writer's group that is supportive and believes in you, and just a level of tenacity and determinedness, and not really focusing on the goal of like what, that you want it to end up a certain way. For me, I feel like I write because I am a pretty sensitive being, and I'm pretty perceptive in terms of like, I can't, like, if I go into a grocery store for more than 30 minutes, I'm like, whoa, it's just so much stimulus for me. And so I think I write as a coping mechanism for that, to channel some of that experience, and to sort of help understand, whatever it is. And as an introverted person, as a sensitive person. And so I don't feel like I have a choice. I think it's why I've done it my whole life. And the more I come to know other writers, the more I'm like, oh, we're a thing. and we're all similar in certain ways that is distinct. You know, we think about the world similarly, we interface with the world similarly, and I think writing is a necessary part of balancing out who we are. And so if you are a young writer and that's who you are, write because of that, and just keep writing and have discipline and create books and keep putting it out there and take all the rejections, and it will lead somewhere. And it's but it's not, you know, it was interesting, you know, watching my husband and go through medical school and then his residency. You know, it's not that concrete journey at all. It's the opposite of that. And of course, there's incredible fatigue with the medical journey where you're having to do superhuman feats on no sleep for, you know, decades. But it is concrete. There's something very not concrete about creative pursuits. And that's both the beauty and the greatest difficulty of it. You never know, you know, you have authors who've only been discovered much later after their death, you know, for example. Particularly now, there's this whole process. My great-grandmother was a collector of art, and she has all these beautiful paintings in my parents' house. And now they're being, you know, women who were painting in the 1920s, and now those women are being discovered as like influencers of Impressionist art. But in their lifetime, they were completely discounted, you know, and so they did it because they loved it and it was who they were. And that's sort of one of my biggest pieces of advice is like, you got to stay with it. You got to do it because you love it and it's who you are, and hang in there and just keep putting one foot in front of the other, because it's not an easy journey. It's not.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you. So I know you have a website. You've mentioned it. So can you tell people where they can find your website as well as where they might be able to interact with you on social media?
So I have tried to do as much as I can, especially with bookstores closed. So I have a website. It's www.sarah with an H, C Patten, Patten. That's my other En, not On, .com.
Yeah.
And I'm also at Sarah C. Patten on Facebook and Instagram. People can find me there. And I'm on Goodreads. And you can certainly, I'm a big promoter of local bookstores. So at finding, going to like indiebound.org, you can find my book there. You can also find it on Amazon if that works better. And I really, really appreciate your podcast and supporting authors, Sarah, and getting the word out about books and allowing people to talk about writing in an open format and your curiosity about my book and your interest. Thank you so, so much.
Oh, you're welcome. And thank you. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me and in such wonderful detail about the book and the process of writing it and research, and letting me ask all my all of my side questions about everything else. Is there anything though that we haven't covered that you really wanted to make sure you brought up before our time was over?
I think that covers it. I think, there's a lot of great books out there that are coming out this year, and with bookstores closed, the more people can get out and support those authors, the better it is for the world at large to have people out there sort of reevaluating life and history and stories and spinning their own stories. And I appreciate the opportunity to be a writer and encourage others to pursue their dreams.
Well, and thank you again. I know I already said thank you, but thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me. I really, really appreciate it.
Yeah, it was great to speak with you as well, and best wishes for the summer.
I had so much fun talking to Sarah about this book, not just because she has a fabulous name. I know you're probably thinking that, but I had so much fun. In fact, after we concluded the recorded part of the interview, we talked for another at least 10 minutes and just chatted and chatted and chatted, and we probably could have chatted for the rest of the afternoon if we didn't have other things that needed to be accomplished with our day. So, Sarah, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. I really, really enjoyed it. Again, the book is called The Measure of Gold. If you are interested in World War II, if you like World War II historical fiction, if you're looking for a story that involves this idea of alchemy and how that fits into a World War II historical fiction novel, you should definitely check out this book, The Measure of Gold. It is very well written. It is very... It's just good. So check it out. You get a strong woman who is in an interesting situation, and from Tennessee to Paris to England, back and forth, and then she ends up as a spy in a brothel. I mean, come on, how you should read the book. Anyway, thank you to Sarah. Thank you, as always, to you, my listeners. If you are a fan of this podcast, please do me the favor of writing a review or giving us a starred review. Either one is awesome and can really help us get this podcast out to more people who love books. You can do that on any platform that you listen to this podcast on, and that would be wonderful. Also, follow me on social media. Well, follow the podcast on social media. I'm extremely boring on social media, but follow the podcast, and you can find GSMC Book Review Podcast on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Would love to hear from you, hear what you're reading, hear what you want to read, hear your book recommendations, etc. I actually just posted a couple weeks ago looking for recommendations for my niece for her birthday, and she loved the selection that I got from that. So I love hearing from readers and knowing what you're reading. Follow me follow the podcast on social media. Next episode, Honest this time. I'll be speaking with Allison Levy about her book, Gatekeeper, the first in her Damon collecting series. Damon collecting series. So join me for that. We'll go from historical fiction to urban fantasy. Hope you're having a great Tuesday, as I said at the beginning, and I hope that Tuesday is continuing to go great. Or whenever, actually, you know what? Whenever you're listening to this podcast, just because it comes out on Tuesday doesn't mean you're listening to it on Tuesday. I hope your day is going well, and I hope that day, whenever it is, has plenty of time for you to get yourself lost in a good book. Thanks.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.